Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to review a piece of media which might be quite useful for people who want to make games with Twine and Sugarcube for inspiration and for an example of what I think is very good design. It's actually not a Twine game, and in fact, it's not a computer game at all. It is from 1993, and it's a game book. That is, it's a book in the sort of choose your own adventure style. In 1993, that was really the tail end of the time when books like that were widely sold. They've continued to be made, but they're more sort of self-published independent things nowadays, and they're mostly sold to sort of older people who played game books as children back in the 80s and 90s. But the 90s or the early 90s was sort of the very end of when you could still find these things in bookshops. And the book that I want to talk about is called Down Among the Dead Men, and it is by Dave Morris. It is pirate themed. It's set in a sort of fictional fantasy version of what's basically the Caribbean. It's not called the Caribbean. It's called something else, but it's one of those settings where really just the names are changed and there's a certain amount of magic that's understood to exist. But it's basically a sort of fictional version of the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean. And you're not really a pirate. You're someone who was on a merchant ship and was forcibly pressed into being part of a pirate crew, and so you have this great hatred for the pirate captain. And I don't want to have any spoilers in this review, even though it's a very old very old piece of media. I'm going to assume that most of the people listening to this haven't encountered it yet. But you escape from the pirate captain, and you are trying to both get away from the pirate captain and also stop a plan that the pirate captain has, which is to kidnap what's essentially Queen Elizabeth I. Again, it's a fantasy version of Queen Elizabeth I, so she's got a different name, but it seems to be sort of obviously intended to be Queen Elizabeth I. And you will find everything that you'd sort of expect off the top of your head from a story about pirates. People going books of maps, pet monkeys, natives that might sort of help you or might kill you, and so on. All of the sort of fun cliches that you'd expect. The series is called the Gamebook series. There was about between 4 and 6 of these things made originally. The series is called Virtual Reality Adventures. That name means absolutely nothing. Virtual reality was just a buzzword at the time. It's just a typical game book. It doesn't have any computerized or virtual reality components. It's purely just a sort of just an empty advertising term. But it does have quite an interesting system in that most of these books, certainly the Fighting Fantasy series, which was probably the number 1 series, and Lone Wolf, which was probably the number 2 series, they're very focused on combat, and they have a fairly lengthy procedure for combat, and they have quite a lot of dice rolling. Whereas virtual reality adventures, including this one, don't use dice at all. The way it works is you pick 4 skills out of a list of, I think, about 12, and the choices that you make along the way will give you various items and also various keywords, which I'll discuss a bit more later. And then you will have options which say things like, well, you're in a boat and rations are running low, and so you lose 2 life points um, out of 10, say, that you start with. And if you, as usual, if you go down to 0 life points or less, you instantly die. You lose 2 life points, but if you have seafaring, then you only lose 1, because you know you have some technique that you know to minimise the effect of the heat. And then later on, you might be in a fight, and it says, well, you lose 3 life points unless you have swordsmanship and a sword, in which case you only lose 1, or something like that. So there's no set system for fighting, but it just sort of handles fighting in an ad hoc way. And I think that's quite good design, because if you have an elaborate system for fighting, the more complicated, not that game books have a very elaborate system for fighting, but if you have a system for fighting, well, you sort of have to have a lot of fights, because it's a bit of a waste having a system for fighting and not using it. And if you have an elaborate system for fighting, well, that sort of implies that you should have lots and lots of fights. And so if you make an elaborate system for a thing, that tends to push you in the direction of making the adventure about that thing. And so it can turn the adventure into just a series of fights, even though the plot might not, that might not be the most logical thing according to the plot. It might be that in the plot you might think, well, why can't I run away from this guy? Why am I fighting him? Wouldn't it make more sense to run and hide? Or I'm in a city here. Can't I call for help from passers-by? No, you have to fight because we have a fighting system. And if we didn't have fights, then we'd have this elaborate fighting system for nothing. And so it sort of, it pushes you. It doesn't force you to have lots of fights, but it does perhaps tend to push you in that direction. And so in not having a system for fights, I think they freed themselves up to have violence, had to have fighting in the plot, but to have it as just one of the options. You can die because you get into a fight and you lose it, but you can also die because you starve to death. You can die because, whatever. So I think that's one example of good design. I also think the thing that is that if I had to sort of pick one thing that's the best thing to learn from this particular book. It's true of perhaps of all of the books in the series, but this one, I just happen to like this one the best, and I think it's probably the best designed. There are very seldom options that are always the best option, or options that are always the worst option. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're faced with some sort of enemy, and you have the option to hide or to confront the enemy. And let's say if you choose hide, then the enemy can't find you and they go away and you survive. And if you choose to confront them, then they kill you and you die and you lose the game. Well, that means that hiding is always the right choice, and fighting them or confronting them is always the wrong choice. And so if someone plays the game again, they will always choose to hide. They'll remember, I remember if I confront this guy. They'll confront the guy once and see where it leads, and then they won't do it again. And that makes the choice sort of effectively not a choice. The player just goes, oh yes, I know what this is. You have to click hide. You have to choose hide. There was one example, the last time I played it, there was one example where it seemed like there was definitely a wrong choice. But most of the time, it'll say something like, let's say you hide, and then it'll say, okay, you're hiding in the jungle. Do you have wilderness law? If you have wilderness law, then you're able to hide successfully. If you don't have wilderness law, then hiding doesn't work. And let's say you confront them, and then it says, okay, do you have intimidation? And if you have intimidation, then confronting them works. And if you don't have intimidation, then things will go badly for you. In other words, there isn't a right choice and a wrong choice. There's a choice that's right if you have one set of skills, and there's a choice that's right if you have another set of skills. And that's more interesting, because the player might come back and say, "Oh, I remember I hid last time and it was no good. So this time I won't hide." But they will have a new character, and the new character might have different skills, and so hiding, now hiding might be the right choice for that character. Hiding might be the right choice. So that seems to be to me. That seems to be more interesting than either having a straight up right choice or wrong choice, or rolling dice and saying, well, if you try and hide, then you roll a dice, and if you roll 1 to 3, then you're able to hide, and if you roll 4 to 6, then you're not. And a sort of, I suppose, a halfway between that would be having perhaps a wilderness law skill, which is a number, and then you roll, and if you roll under or equal to your wilderness law skill, then you're able to successfully hide. But the point is that you should make choices that aren't the right choice and the wrong choice. That you should have choices that are, one choice is right in a particular set of circumstances with particular items and skills and keywords, and another choice is the right choice given a different set of those things. And for the most part, from what I remember, they seem to be aware of, or Dave Morris is only one author. Dave Morris seems to have been aware of this, and seems to have constructed the book with that in mind. Another thing I want to talk about before I go is keywords. What I've found is that games of this type, it's quite interesting if your choices have consequences much later. If the choices that you make you don't get immediate feedback on whether it was right or wrong, but you get feedback later. It sort of feels like you're affecting the world. So an example of that might be that you have a choice to be friendly to a particular character or hostile to them. And if you're hostile to them, it might get you some reward immediately. But then later on, there's an option where if you were hostile to this character beforehand, then something bad will happen to you later in the story, or perhaps it will happen to you later in the story if you go to a particular market or something like that. I don't know why, but it feels a bit more fun. You go, oh yeah, I remember that guy, yeah, and it sort of comes back to bite you on the arse, or perhaps comes back to reward you. You help someone, and then later on in the story, that turns out to have been there turns out to be some advantage in that if you take other particular choices. And the way that they record it in a book, because of course it's not a computer program, you can't have variables. If it was a computer game, you'd just have variables that were updated, and the player wouldn't see any of it. In this, you have keywords, so it'll say, if you choose to do this, okay, write down the keyword such and such, and then later on it will say, if you have the keyword such and such, cross it off, or if you have the keyword such and such, go to this paragraph. Otherwise, do something else. And so you find out, you had the opportunity to get a better boat, for example, and you didn't do that, and so this is the point where having the not as good boat is gonna bite you on the arse. So there's a lot. I mean, apart from it's quite fun. I found it quite enjoyable. It's an example of quite good design, and if you want to make games of this type, which is the sort of default for what Twine is for. Twine was basically invented or created to be for making choose your own adventure style games. This is an example of very good design. So, albeit, it's quite old. So it hasn't aged badly, considering it's like, 40 years old. No, wait, that can't be right. 1993, that would be, hang on, 1993, 2003, 2013, 30 years old, sorry. It hasn't aged as badly as perhaps some things that are 30 years old. There's some natives that might turn out to be cannibals, but to be fair, there were actual cannibals in that area. So it's not particularly. There's nothing that really will make you go, oh, gee, that's not great. At least nothing that made me react that way. Finally, I would like to tell you how you can get it if you're interested in getting it. I will put links in the description, but I will say that there used to be an app version of it that you could download from the App Store if you had an iPad. Unfortunately, that's no longer available, I think because iPad software is updated so that it no longer runs and they didn't bother. It wasn't worth updating the software to make it still work. So unfortunately, you'll find that, but it's not available anymore. You can order the PDF through Drive-Through RPG, and that costs, when I looked today anyway, that costs US dollars $2.99 for a PDF. So it's not very expensive. You can also order a physical copy. The physical copies that I saw were considerably more expensive, like maybe 10 times the cost. And I also found on archive.org you can download the original version. I don't think there's anything different except the artwork between the original version and the current version. You can download the original version for free. Now, a lot of the things on archive.org, I'm not sure that they've completely got permission from the original publishers. I think archive, sort of anyone can upload anything. So, I don't know. I don't know that they haven't, but I don't know that the publishers have given permission for that to be up there. And certainly, you would still need to get that permission to do it lawfully. But anyway, it is on archive.org as of today, and you can download the original version there for free. So I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.